Before the first cities rose from the earth, before roads, before writing, before memory itself had a name, human beings were already inventing. Tonight there are no dates you need to remember, no arguments to follow, no mysteries you must solve, only stories, stories of quiet hands shaping stone, of minds observing the sky night after night, of knowledge built slowly, patiently, and then forgotten. As the world learned to move faster, some of its earliest wisdom was left behind. And so let us begin not with noise or urgency, but with wonder. Imagine a coastline 2,000 years ago. The sea is calm. A merchant ship drifts beneath the sun, its wooden hull creaking softly with the rhythm of the waves. Below deck, bronze objects rest in the dark, packed tightly among amphorae and tools. No one aboard suspects that one small bundle of metal will one day challenge everything we think we know about ancient knowledge. The ship will not reach its destination. A storm will come. The vessel will sink slowly, quietly into the deep, and there for nearly 2 millennia it will sleep. When divers finally find the wreck, centuries later, they see statues, pottery, coins, familiar things, but among the corrosion and encrusted stone lies something stranger, something delicate, something impossibly precise. A mass of greened bronze cracked by time. At first it appears meaningless. Only when it is carefully cleaned, slowly examined, does the truth begin to emerge. Inside the lump of metal are gears, dozens of them, perfectly cut, interlocking, designed with intention. This is not decoration. This is not art. This is a machine, and not a simple one. It tracks cycles, predicts eclipses, follows the wandering paths of planets across the sky. It encodes astronomical knowledge so advanced that until its discovery, scholars believed such mechanisms would not exist for another 1,000 years. No electricity, no steel, no factories, just bronze, patience, and deep understanding. Picture the workshop where it was made, a quiet room lit by oil lamps, the soft scrape of metal on metal. Hands steady, breath slow as teeth are filed into tiny gears, each one measured, tested, refined. This was not accidental brilliance. It was the result of generations of thought. And yet the knowledge to build such machines did not spread. It did not ignite an industrial revolution. It did not transform the ancient world. Instead, it vanished. When the last craftsman who understood its workings died, the machine became silent. History moved on, and this is how much of ancient technology disappears. Not in catastrophe, but in quiet. Now let us move from the sea to the land, to stone and time. Walk with me through an ancient harbor. The air smells of salt. Waves lap gently against massive concrete walls. Ships come and go, empires rise and fall. And still the harbor remains. Centuries pass, storms batter the coast. Earthquakes shake the land. The sea claws at the stone with endless patience. Modern concrete cracks, steel rusts, repairs are constant, but these ancient structures grow stronger. Their secret lies not in strength alone, but in chemistry. Volcanic ash mixed with lime and seawater, a reaction that continues long after the builders are gone. Crystals form slowly within the concrete, knitting it together, healing fractures as they appear. It is a living material, designed without knowing the word. Modern engineers study it now, trying to replicate what was once common knowledge. The ancient builders did not leave instruction manuals. They did not publish formulas. They learned by doing, by watching stone endure. When the empire fell, so did the tradition, not because it failed, but because no one thought it could ever be forgotten. This pattern repeats again and again. Knowledge passed hand to hand, master to apprentice, never written, never standardized, strong while the chain holds. Fragile when it breaks. Let us step now into a small workshop far from the sea. The room is warm. Sunlight filters through dust in the air. On a table sits a clay jar. Inside it, a simple arrangement of copper and iron, nothing dramatic, nothing loud. If liquid fills the jar, something subtle happens. A current flows, not enough to light a city, not enough to power machines, just enough to coat metal, to alter surfaces, to reveal a quiet understanding of electricity. Did the maker know the word for it? No, but knowledge does not require vocabulary to exist. Sometimes it lives only in practice. When the workshop closed, when the jars broke, the idea faded. Centuries later, we would rediscover electricity and believe we had found something new. But in truth, we were remembering, and not all forgotten technologies were gentle. Some were fiercely protected, closely guarded, known only to a few. Picture a night sea, dark water, no moon. A fleet approaches a city by ship, then fire appears. But this fire does not behave as fire should. It dances across the water's surface. It clings. It burns brighter when touched by waves. Panic spreads. The formula behind this flame is known to only a handful of people. It is passed orally, never written down. When the empire that guarded it fell, the knowledge fell with it. Today we know it existed. We know what it did, but we do not know how to make it. The secret was not lost to time. It was buried with intention. Now let us leave fire and sea behind and enter a place of curiosity. A city of scholars, a place where ideas are toys. Here inventions are not made to conquer but to explore. A small device sits on a stand, a hollow sphere. When water boils beneath it, steam escapes through angled nozzles. The sphere begins to spin, round and round. The first engine powered by steam, a novelty, a demonstration, something to amuse, to inspire, but not to change the world. The idea arrives too early. There is no economic pressure to replace labor, no fuel shortage, no urgency, and so the engine remains a curiosity. History passes it by. Centuries later, when steam is rediscovered, the world will transform, not because the idea was new, but because the time was right. This is an uncomfortable truth. Progress is not a straight line. It advances, rests, and sometimes retreats. Not all knowledge moves forward together. Some of it waits patiently. For a future that can understand it, let us travel now to the mountains. High stone walls rise against the sky. No mortar holds them together, no metal tools shape them. And yet each stone fits its neighbor with impossible precision, so tight that even a blade of grass cannot pass between them. These walls bend slightly inward. They flex when the earth shakes. They survive earthquakes that reduce modern buildings to rubble. The builders did not use wheels. They did not use iron. They used time. Observation, trial and error across generations. Their techniques were never written down. When the culture was disrupted, the knowledge vanished. Stone remembers, people forget. And so we arrive at a question, not a loud one, a quiet one. How much of what we call modern is simply rediscovered? How many ideas have visited humanity before only to leave when conditions were not right? The past is not primitive, it is selective. Tonight, as your breathing slows, as the weight of the day begins to fade, remember this: human ingenuity has always been with us. It does not belong to one era. It does not move in one direction. Sometimes it builds machines that predict the stars and then disappears beneath the sea. Sometimes it shapes stone that outlives empires and then waits silently for rediscovery. And sometimes it whispers softly until someone somewhere is ready to listen again. We will continue soon. For now, let the mind rest. The story is not finished. Let us continue. Gently, without haste, from where the last thought settled. If you listen closely to history, you begin to notice that it rarely shouts. It murmurs. It leaves traces not in headlines, but in the quiet persistence of things that should not exist or should not last, yet somehow do. So let us slow our steps even further now and walk into the spaces between invention and memory. Consider the act of measurement. Today, we surround ourselves with numbers. The clocks divide our hours into perfect segments. Calendars arrange time into neat grids. Satellites whisper coordinates to us from the sky. But long before this precision had names, human beings were already measuring the universe. They measured shadows, they counted heartbeats, they watched stars rise and fall from the same stone markers night after night, year after year. In ancient cities, tall pillars stood quietly in open courtyards. As the sun moved, shadows stretched and retreated. From these slow movements, people learned the rhythm of seasons. They predicted floods. They timed planting and harvest. They aligned entire cities with celestial events that occurred only once or twice in a lifetime. This knowledge was not written in books. It lived in memory, in ritual, in repetition. And when the ritual stopped, when the observers were gone, the pillars became meaningless stones. The knowledge did not disappear violently. It simply faded. Now imagine a physician thousands of years ago. No white coat, no laboratory, only plants gathered from hillsides and observations passed quietly from elder to apprentice. Which leaves calm pain, which roots slow bleeding, which preparations must never be mixed. Some ancient surgical instruments were astonishingly precise. Scalpels shaped for specific procedures, needles finer than expected, tools designed not just to cut but to heal. Trepanation, the practice of drilling small holes into the skull, sounds alarming to modern ears. Yet skulls have been found showing signs of careful surgery and long-term survival afterward. The body, too, was once understood differently, not less accurately, but through another lens. Illness was imbalance, healing was restoration. When these systems were replaced, not all of their insight survived the transition. Some remedies vanished because they were never recorded. Others were dismissed because they did not fit new frameworks. Knowledge does not always survive improvement. Let us move now into the realm of sound. Music, vibration, the invisible architecture of air. Ancient instruments were tuned not only to please the ear, but to resonate with the body. Certain tones were believed to calm the heart, others to sharpen the mind. Some were reserved for sleep and played slowly, softly, beneath the open sky. In stone chambers, voices could carry in strange ways. A single hum could ripple across a room, returning richer, deeper, transformed. Some structures appeared designed for this effect, not accidentally, intentionally. Sound shaping space, space shaping experience. When these places fell silent, their acoustic wisdom went unnoticed. Today, engineers rediscover these principles through microphones and software, but long ago they were learned by listening. And then there is light, not electricity but flame. Oil lamps designed to burn without smoke. Mirrors polished so carefully they could focus sunlight. Rooms arranged to catch dawn and dusk in deliberate ways. In some ancient cities, daylight was guided inward through narrow passages, cooling interiors while illuminating them softly. These were passive technologies, no switches, no wires, just understanding. When energy became cheap and abundant, such subtle design was no longer necessary, and so it was forgotten. Let us pause here for a moment, breathe slowly. Notice how often progress replaces wisdom, not because wisdom failed, but because speed became more valuable. Now we turn to materials, not iron, not steel, but things humbler and stranger. Ancient glassmakers created vessels that shimmered with impossible colors. Some changed hue depending on the angle of light. Others glowed faintly when struck by the sun. For centuries, these effects were thought to be decorative accidents. Only recently did scientists realize what was happening. Nanoparticles embedded unintentionally within the glass. Technology hiding in art. The craftsmen did not know the term, they did not need to, they knew the result. And when their techniques were lost, the colors vanished too. Textiles too held secrets, dyes made from plants and insects that resisted fading for centuries. Cloth woven so tightly it repelled water. Patterns encoded with meaning, status, direction, time. Some fabrics were lighter than expected, others stronger. The process to create them was complex, often taking months or years. When faster methods emerged, these techniques were abandoned. Speed won, durability lost. Let us walk further into the realm of navigation. Before compasses, before charts, sailors crossed vast oceans guided by stars, waves, birds, and clouds. They read the sea like a living map, the direction of swells, the color of water, the flight paths of seabirds at dawn. This knowledge was taught orally, practiced from childhood. It could not be written easily. It had to be lived. When instruments replaced intuition, the old ways faded, not because they were inferior, but because they were fragile. There's a pattern forming now, you may feel it. A rhythm, advanced knowledge held lightly, passed personally, easily broken. We assume that writing preserves truth, but writing can also replace memory. When memory weakens, written knowledge becomes brittle. And when the written record is lost, nothing remains. Now let us consider cities again, not their grandeur, but their organization. Some ancient urban layouts managed waste efficiently. Fresh water flowed separately from sewage. Ventilation cooled dense neighborhoods naturally. These were not accidents. They were responses to climate, terrain, and population. When cities expanded too quickly, when empires collapsed, maintenance stopped. The systems failed. Later generations assumed such sophistication had never existed. There is something deeply human in this cycle. We solve problems, then forget why we solved them. We inherit solutions without context. When the context changes, the solutions are discarded, and sometimes the problem returns. As your thoughts drift more slowly now, let us visit one final quiet space, a library not of books but of minds. In ancient schools, learning was communal, dialogues, walks, questions asked not to be answered but to be explored. Some inventions were philosophical before they were practical. Ideas about atoms, about motion, about infinity. They existed without instruments to prove them. When later societies demanded proof before belief, some ideas were set aside, only to return centuries later confirmed by tools that did not yet exist. This is not failure, it is timing, and now perhaps you are beginning to feel it. The soft realization that humanity has never been simple, that brilliance does not belong to the present alone, that progress is not a ladder but a tide, rising, falling, leaving patterns in the sand. As your breathing deepens, let these thoughts loosen their grip. You do not need to hold them. They will remain as history always does, quietly waiting. We will continue from here next time, from the edge of memory into what was nearly lost and what may yet return. There is a peculiar stillness that settles over places once filled with purpose. An abandoned workshop, a ruined observatory, a stone road leading nowhere in particular. These places do not announce their importance. They simply wait. And in their silence, they ask a question that history rarely answers directly. What was known here that is no longer remembered? Consider tools, not the grand inventions that reshape empires, but the small ones. A finely balanced chisel, a measuring cord marked with careful knots, a mold used to cast the same shape again and again with astonishing consistency. Such tools suggest standardization, planning, repeatability. They suggest that someone once cared deeply about precision. Many ancient sites, identical objects appear across wide distances. The same proportions, the same angles, the same tolerances. This tells us something quiet but important. Knowledge was shared, techniques were taught, there were systems, even if they left no paperwork behind. When those systems dissolved, the tools remained, but the method did not. Without the method, the tool becomes puzzling, its purpose unclear, its brilliance muted. Now let us step into water again, not the open sea this time, but underground, in dry landscapes where rain is rare. Ancient people learned to listen to the earth. They dug gently, carefully. They found aquifers hidden beneath stone. They carved channels that followed the land's natural slope, allowing water to travel long distances without pumps. These underground canals stayed cool, protected from evaporation, protected from contamination. Some still function today. Modern engineers marvel at their efficiency, their sustainability. Yet the communities that built them often disappeared, leaving behind systems too subtle to be immediately understood. Water continued to flow, but the wisdom behind it did not. There is a lesson here, though we will not force it into words. Let us turn now to timekeeping again, not clocks but calendars. Some ancient calendars were more accurate than those used centuries later. They accounted for leap years, for lunar drift, for cycles that repeat over decades, not days. These calendars were not abstract, they were lived. Festivals, agriculture, navigation. Time was not something to be managed, it was something to be aligned with. When cultures changed, when belief systems shifted, calendars were replaced. Accuracy sometimes gave way to symbolism, and precision was lost not because it was wrong, but because it was no longer meaningful. Now imagine a craftsman shaping wood, not quickly, not to meet a deadline, but slowly, listening to the grain, feeling resistance. The final object fits perfectly in the hand, balanced, comfortable. Such craftsmanship requires intimacy with material, an understanding that cannot be rushed. In a world that later valued quantity over quality, this intimacy faded. Mass production replaced mastery, and with it a kind of knowledge disappeared, not the knowledge of how to make something exist, but how to make it right. Let us pause again, allow the mind to drift as though floating on calm water. Some ancient technologies were not physical at all. They lived in organization, in social systems, in ways of distributing labor and responsibility. Some societies rotated leadership to prevent stagnation. Others balanced power through complex networks of obligation and gift-giving. These systems were not written as laws, they were lived traditions. When external structures replaced them, their effectiveness was overlooked. Modern systems often rediscover these principles, renamed, reframed, presented as innovations, but they are echoes. Now let us visit the night sky once more. Imagine standing beneath it without light pollution, the stars sharp, countless. Ancient observers did not see chaos there, they saw order, patterns that returned, cycles that repeated. They tracked these movements with stones, with memory, with story. Stories were not entertainment alone, they were data storage. A constellation was easier to remember when it was also a hero, an animal, a warning. When stories were dismissed as myth, their embedded knowledge was dismissed too. Only fragments survived. This brings us to a quiet truth. Information is not always preserved in the form we expect. When we look only for books, we miss songs. When we look only for diagrams, we miss rituals. When we look only for machines, we miss relationships. Ancient technology often lived in these softer places, and so it slipped through the cracks of history. Now imagine a child learning, not in a classroom, but beside a parent, a grandparent, learning by watching, by imitating, mistakes corrected gently, success reinforced with patience. This is slow learning, deep learning. It produces fewer experts but stronger ones. When education became centralized, this method weakened. Knowledge became broader but shallower. Some skills could not survive that transition. There is no villain here, only change. Let us think now of healing again. Some ancient practices emphasized prevention over cure, balance over intervention, diet, movement, rest. These were technologies too, just not mechanical ones. As medicine advanced, acute care improved dramatically, but preventative wisdom was sometimes sidelined. Only now, centuries later, do we return to ideas of balance, sleep, stress, rediscovering what was once obvious. You may feel a pattern settling in again, a gentle looping, discovery, forgetting, rediscovery. This is not a flaw in humanity, it is a rhythm. As your thoughts slow further, let us consider writing itself. Writing preserves words, but it also freezes them. Once written, knowledge can stop evolving. In oral traditions, ideas adapt constantly. They are corrected, refined, kept alive through use. When writing replaces memory entirely, knowledge becomes static. If the written record is lost, there is no living backup. Some ancient cultures chose not to write certain things down, not because they could not, but because they understood the risk. When those cultures vanished, their reasoning vanished too, and now a softer reflection. Perhaps not all forgotten technologies were meant to last forever. Perhaps some were designed for specific times, specific needs, specific values. When those values changed, the technology no longer fit. Not all loss is tragedy, some is transition. As you rest here, suspended between thought and sleep, remember this gently. The past is not distant. It is layered beneath the present, like stone beneath soil. We walk upon it every day, often without noticing. Sometimes a fragment surfaces, a tool, a structure, an idea, and for a moment we glimpse a different way of understanding the world. Then the moment passes, and that is enough. When we speak of forgotten technologies, we often imagine dramatic moments of loss, sudden collapses, or catastrophic endings. Yet far more often the truth is quieter and more subtle, shaped not by destruction, but by gradual shifts in attention, priorities, and values that slowly redirected human effort elsewhere. In many cases, knowledge did not vanish because it failed, but because it was no longer asked for, no longer practiced daily, and no longer woven into the rhythm of ordinary life where memory is strongest and most enduring. A technique unused is a technique already beginning to fade. And so, let us linger for a while in this gentle space between use and abandonment, where technologies still function, still exist, but are no longer understood in their fullness. Imagine a road laid carefully stone by stone, stretching across hills, valleys, and rivers, following a path that seems almost intuitive, as though it were listening to the land rather than forcing itself upon it. Ancient roads were not always built to be straight, but to endure. They curved where floods might come, rose where water pooled, and dipped gently where the terrain allowed passage without erosion. Some of these roads lasted for centuries, supporting trade, communication, and cultural exchange across vast regions, long after the societies that built them had changed or disappeared. Yet when newer roads were laid, optimized for speed rather than longevity, the older methods were dismissed as inefficient, their deeper understanding of landscape quietly forgotten. Only later, when modern roads washed away or fractured under stress, did engineers begin to ask why some ancient paths had endured for so long. The answer was not hidden in advanced tools, but in patience, observation, and respect for natural systems. Now turn your thoughts toward heat, warmth, and the quiet art of controlling temperature long before modern heating or cooling systems existed. In arid climates and dense cities alike, ancient builders designed homes that breathed with the environment, drawing cool air inward and allowing warm air to rise and escape, creating a steady circulation without a single moving part. Thick walls absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night, stabilizing interior temperatures in a way that modern buildings often struggle to replicate. Courtyards, shaded corridors, and carefully placed openings worked together as a unified system, responding to sunlight, wind direction, and seasonal change. This was not accidental architecture. It was environmental engineering shaped by long familiarity with place. When cheap energy made mechanical solutions easier, this wisdom became optional, and when it became optional, it became rare. Now, as energy grows costly once more, these ancient ideas quietly return, rediscovered rather than remembered. Let us slow even further now and think about motion. Not the fast motion of machines, but the controlled movement of water, grain, and people through carefully designed systems. Water wheels turned steadily in rivers, powering mills that ground grain, shaped wood, and lifted water for irrigation, all without smoke, fuel, or noise beyond the soft rush of flowing water. These systems were tuned to local conditions, designed to work with specific river speeds and seasonal variations, and maintained by communities who depended on them directly. When centralized power replaced local energy sources, such systems were dismantled or abandoned, seen as outdated rather than elegantly sufficient. Yet today, as we seek sustainable energy again, we find ourselves returning to the same principles, rediscovering how much can be done with gravity, flow, and balance alone. Consider now the storage of food, a technology so fundamental that it often goes unnoticed. Long before refrigeration, people developed methods to preserve nourishment through fermentation, drying, salting, smoking, and controlled burial beneath cool earth. These techniques were refined through generations, producing not only longevity but flavor, nutrition, and safety. Fermented foods supported gut health without anyone needing to name the bacteria involved. Root cellars maintained steady temperatures year-round, using nothing more than depth and insulation. When modern preservation arrived, these methods were sidelined, sometimes lost entirely, until science eventually confirmed what tradition had long known. Here again, technology existed not as machinery, but as practice, and practices fade quickly when they are no longer lived. Now let your thoughts drift toward mathematics, not as symbols on a page, but as an embodied understanding of proportion, rhythm, and harmony. Ancient builders did not calculate stress loads with equations, yet their structures often distributed weight with remarkable efficiency, using ratios observed in nature and refined through repeated experience. Bridges, arches, and domes rose not through theoretical certainty, but through accumulated wisdom, passed from master to apprentice over decades of shared labor. When formal mathematics replaced experiential learning, something was gained, but something else was loosened. Knowledge became transferable at scale, but less rooted in material intuition. And when disasters struck structures built without such intuition, the gap between calculation and understanding became visible once more. Let us think now of writing and its complicated relationship with memory. Writing allows knowledge to travel across time and distance, but it also encourages dependence upon itself. When information is always available externally, the internal structures of memory weaken. Some ancient cultures understood this tension and chose to preserve certain knowledge only through oral transmission, song, and ritual repetition, ensuring that it remained alive within people rather than stored apart from them. Such knowledge adapted continuously, correcting itself as it passed through many minds, but it was also vulnerable. When communities fractured or were displaced, that knowledge vanished entirely, leaving behind no trace for historians to examine. What survives then is often not what was most important, but what happened to be written down. Now, consider craftsmanship once more and the long relationship between hand and material. In many ancient trades, mastery was measured not by speed, but by sensitivity, by the ability to feel minute differences in resistance, texture, and balance. This kind of knowledge cannot be rushed, automated, or easily standardized. It requires time, repetition, and attention. As societies began to value efficiency above all else, These slow skills were seen as expendable luxuries rather than essential foundations. Yet when mass-produced objects break easily, wear poorly, or fail unexpectedly, we begin to recognize what was lost along the way. Durability, once normal, becomes exceptional. Let us return again to the night sky, but this time not to observe it, but to navigate by it. Long before modern instruments, travelers used stars not only as markers of direction, but as clocks, calendars, and compasses combined. They knew when certain stars would rise, how their position changed with latitude, and what their appearance foretold about weather and season. This knowledge was not theoretical, it was practical, embodied, and essential for survival. When mechanical navigation tools became common, such skills were no longer necessary for most people, and so they faded into obscurity. Yet when instruments fail, it is often these ancient methods that quietly return, remembered by a few and relearned by necessity. As we continue, notice how often forgotten technologies are not complex in appearance, but subtle in operation. They do not announce themselves loudly. They integrate seamlessly into daily life, and because of that, they are easily overlooked by those who search history only for dramatic breakthroughs and monumental change. Some of the most powerful technologies humanity has ever developed were never recognized as such at all. Now let us reflect gently on the idea of progress. Progress suggests improvement, advancement, and accumulation, but accumulation can also obscure. As layers of new solutions pile up, older ones are buried not because they failed, but because they no longer fit within the prevailing narrative. And yet when conditions change, when resources grow scarce, when systems strain under their own complexity, it is often those buried ideas that resurface, surprisingly relevant once more. History, then, is less a straight line and more a slow, looping path, returning again and again to familiar ground from a slightly different angle. As your breathing deepens and the mind grows softer, allow this thought to rest gently within you. Human intelligence has always been adaptive, creative, and deeply responsive to its environment. What changes is not our capacity, but our context. Technologies arise to meet specific needs, shaped by the values, pressures, and resources of their time. When those conditions shift, the technologies may fade, even if their underlying wisdom remains sound. There comes a point, when listening to stories like these, where the boundary between past and present begins to soften, and the ancient world no longer feels distant or unreachable, but strangely familiar, as though it were another version of ourselves, living under different skies, facing different constraints, yet guided by the same quiet curiosity that still shapes human thought today. In this softened space, it becomes easier to understand that forgotten technologies are not simply objects or techniques left behind, but expressions of how people once related to the world around them, how they listened to nature, how they observed patterns over long stretches of time, and how they responded with solutions that were often elegant precisely because they were limited by necessity. Necessity, after all, has always been one of humanity's most patient teachers. Imagine a community living at the edge of a forest where wood is plentiful but metal is scarce, and where every tool must be made with care because replacement is difficult and waste carries real consequences. In such a place, tools are not disposable, nor are they thought of as temporary conveniences, but as companions that may last a lifetime or even be passed from one generation to the next, carrying with them the marks of use, repair, and quiet familiarity. Handles are shaped to fit the hand exactly, worn smooth by years of repeated motion, and blades are sharpened not aggressively, but thoughtfully, preserving strength rather than sacrificing it for short-term performance. This kind of relationship with technology fosters a deep awareness of limits, and within those limits, creativity flourishes. When resources later become abundant, that awareness weakens, and with it, a certain attentiveness to consequence quietly fades. Now let us turn our attention to something even more subtle, the management of waste. It is not a subject often associated with technological sophistication, yet many ancient societies developed remarkably effective systems for handling refuse, recycling materials, and returning organic matter back to the earth in ways that supported agriculture and public health. Food scraps fed animals or composted into soil. Broken tools were melted down, reshaped, or repurposed. Buildings were dismantled carefully, their stones reused rather than discarded. Nothing was truly considered useless, only temporarily without purpose. This was not ideology, it was practicality shaped by scarcity. When industrial systems introduced cheap materials and mass production, waste became easier to ignore, and with that shift, an entire philosophy of resource stewardship slowly disappeared. Only now, as landfills grow and ecosystems strain, do we begin to recognize how advanced those earlier practices truly were. As we drift further into reflection, consider how ancient people understood risk, uncertainty, and resilience, concepts that modern systems often struggle to balance. Rather than optimizing everything for maximum efficiency, many traditional technologies favored redundancy, flexibility, and adaptability, allowing systems to fail gracefully rather than catastrophically. Agricultural fields were diversified rather than monocropped, reducing the risk of total loss. Water systems had multiple routes and backups. Settlements were designed to relocate or adapt when conditions changed, rather than resist change at all costs. This approach did not produce maximum output, but it produced stability across generations. When modern systems prioritize speed and efficiency above resilience, they may outperform older methods in the short term, but they often become fragile under stress. And so, once again, ancient wisdom quietly waits for rediscovery. Let us think now of communication, not as instant messaging or written correspondence, but as the slow, deliberate transmission of meaning across time and distance through shared symbols, gestures, and traditions. In many ancient cultures, information was embedded in art, architecture, and ritual, creating layered systems of communication that conveyed social rules, historical memory, and practical knowledge simultaneously. A pattern woven into cloth might indicate lineage, territory, or seasonal timing. A carving on a building might mark an astronomical event or a historical turning point. These messages were not meant to be read quickly, but absorbed gradually through repeated exposure and lived experience. When literacy expanded and written language became dominant, these slower forms of communication lost prominence, and with them, entire libraries of encoded knowledge quietly faded from understanding. As your awareness settles into this gentle rhythm, consider the role of patience in all of these forgotten technologies, and how fundamentally different that value is from the pace that dominates much of modern life. Patience allowed ancient builders to wait years before seeing the results of their work. It allowed farmers to observe cycles that unfolded over decades. It allowed healers to test remedies carefully, adjusting them slowly based on outcomes rather than rushing toward immediate results. This patience was not passive. It was active, attentive, and deeply engaged with the passage of time. When impatience becomes the norm, such long-view thinking becomes difficult to sustain, and technologies that require it are often abandoned not because they fail, but because they demand too much stillness. Now let us gently shift toward the idea of scale. Many ancient technologies were intentionally small scale, designed to serve communities rather than empires, individuals rather than markets. They were adapted to local conditions, local materials, and local needs, making them difficult to standardize or export widely. This limited their spread, but it also made them highly efficient within their context. When larger systems emerged, favoring uniformity and scalability, these localized technologies were often replaced, even if the replacements were less suited to specific environments. The loss, then, was not just technological, but ecological, as solutions became increasingly detached from place. Only recently has the value of local adaptation begun to re-emerge in conversations about sustainability and resilience. As we continue, let us return briefly to the human body itself, one of the oldest and most sophisticated technologies humanity has ever known. Ancient practices of movement, posture, breathing, and rest were often developed not for performance, but for longevity, comfort, and balance. Daily activities were structured in ways that kept bodies strong without deliberate exercise. Work and rest alternated naturally. Sleep followed environmental cues rather than artificial schedules. When modern life reorganized these patterns, the body adapted as best it could, but not without consequence. Only now do we rediscover breathing techniques, movement practices, and rhythms of rest that were once simply part of everyday life, forgotten not because they were ineffective, but because they were too ordinary to be preserved intentionally. Notice how often forgetting happens not through rejection, but through neglect. What is not valued explicitly tends to disappear quietly. What is assumed to be obvious rarely gets recorded. And so much of what sustained ancient societies never entered the historical record at all. It lived in habits, routines, and shared understanding, all of which vanish quickly when circumstances change. This creates a skewed picture of the past, where monumental achievements are remembered, but the subtle systems that made daily life possible are overlooked. Yet it is precisely those subtle systems that often hold the most enduring lessons. As your mind drifts further into rest, consider this gentle perspective, that humanity has never been on a single path of progress, but has instead explored many paths simultaneously, some wide and visible, others narrow and easily lost. Technologies are tools for navigating these paths, shaped as much by values as by necessity. When values change, technologies follow. What seems advanced in one era may seem irrelevant in another, not because it lacks merit, but because it no longer aligns with prevailing priorities. Now let us slow once more, allowing the pace of the narration itself to mirror the subject it describes. There is no urgency here, no destination that must be reached quickly. The value lies in the movement itself, in the gentle unfolding of thought, much like the slow accumulation of knowledge across generations. Forgotten technologies remind us that intelligence does not always announce itself loudly, and that wisdom often hides in plain sight, waiting patiently for attention to return. As we rest within this understanding, let the images soften, stone warming in the sun, water moving steadily through carved channels, hands shaping wood, clay, and metal with care, stars turning slowly overhead. These are not relics of a distant past. They are expressions of a way of thinking that still exists quietly beneath the surface of modern life. And as long as human beings continue to observe, adapt, and imagine, that way of thinking will never truly disappear. It may fade, it may rest, but it will always remain possible to remember. As we drift deeper into this quiet reflection, it becomes easier to sense that forgotten technologies are not scattered randomly across history, but tend to gather around moments when human life was closely aligned with the rhythms of the natural world, when observation was a daily practice rather than a specialized profession, and when solutions emerged gradually from lived experience instead of being imposed suddenly from abstract plans. In those times, people did not separate themselves sharply from their surroundings, and technology was not something external or distant, but an extension of the way hands moved, eyes watched, and minds patiently connected one pattern to another over long stretches of time. This closeness shaped inventions that felt less like tools and more like conversations with the environment, responding gently rather than dominating forcefully. Think for a moment about agriculture, not as an industry, but as a relationship between people, soil, weather, and time, developed slowly through observation rather than instruction manuals or chemical formulas. Ancient farmers learned to read the land with extraordinary sensitivity, noticing subtle differences in soil color, texture, and smell, understanding which crops thrived in which conditions, and rotating plantings in ways that preserved fertility without ever naming the concept. They built terraces that slowed erosion, captured moisture, and created microclimates where food could grow even on steep hillsides. They saved seeds selectively, choosing not only for yield, but for resilience, flavor, and adaptability to changing conditions. When industrial agriculture later emphasized uniformity, speed, and scale, these slower methods were dismissed as inefficient, and much of the accumulated wisdom behind them was lost or marginalized. Only now, as soils degrade and ecosystems strain, do we begin to understand how advanced those ancient practices truly were. Let us move now from the fields into the homes of the past, not the palaces or monuments, but the ordinary dwellings where daily life unfolded quietly. In these spaces, technology took the form of simple but thoughtful design choices that shaped comfort, health, and well-being in ways that often go unnoticed. Cooking areas were placed to allow smoke to escape naturally. Sleeping spaces were oriented away from prevailing winds. Storage areas were built into the structure of the home, keeping food cool and dry without additional effort. Every element served multiple purposes, reducing complexity while increasing reliability. These homes were not static objects, but living systems, adjusted over time as families grew, seasons changed, and lessons were learned. When modern housing prioritized speed of construction and standardized layouts, many of these adaptive features disappeared, replaced by systems that required constant external energy to function. Once again, convenience replaced understanding, and with it, a quiet form of technological intelligence faded into the background. As we continue, let us think gently about tools of perception, the ways ancient people extended their senses beyond immediate experience. Without telescopes, they tracked the movements of distant planets. Without microscopes, they observed patterns of growth, decay, and transformation in plants, animals, and the human body. They learned to infer invisible processes from visible signs, developing forms of reasoning that were deeply intuitive, yet often remarkably accurate. This kind of perception-based technology relied on patience and repetition rather than instrumentation, and it trained the mind to notice subtle changes that modern tools sometimes obscure by offering instant answers. When instruments became more powerful, this form of attentiveness weakened, and with it, a certain sensitivity to gradual change. Now, as we seek to understand complex systems like climate, ecosystems, and long-term health, we find ourselves rediscovering the importance of observation that unfolds over years rather than moments. Let us pause briefly here, allowing the rhythm of the narration to slow further, mirroring the gradual pace of the ideas themselves. There is no rush, nothing needs to be concluded quickly. The value lies in the gentle accumulation of understanding, much like the way ancient knowledge itself was built. Consider now the role of community in sustaining technology across generations. Many forgotten techniques required not just individual skill, but collective participation, shared responsibility, and mutual trust. Irrigation systems had to be maintained together. Harvests required coordinated effort. Knowledge was distributed across many people rather than concentrated in a few specialists. This distribution made systems resilient, but it also made them vulnerable to social disruption. When communities fractured through migration, conquest, or economic change, the knowledge embedded within them dispersed and dissolved. Later societies, encountering the remnants of these systems without the social structures that supported them, often failed to understand how they worked. The technology appeared mysterious, not because it was advanced beyond comprehension, but because its context had vanished. As your thoughts drift more deeply now, let us explore the idea of repair, a concept that held far greater importance in the past than it often does today. In many ancient cultures, repairing an object was not seen as restoring it to an original state, but as continuing its story, acknowledging wear, and adapting it to new circumstances. Repairs were visible, sometimes even celebrated, marking the passage of time and the relationship between people and their tools. This approach encouraged maintenance, care, and longevity, extending the life of technology far beyond its initial creation. When modern systems emphasize replacement over repair, this relationship changes and objects become transient, disposable, and easily forgotten. With them goes the knowledge of how to maintain, adapt, and understand them deeply. Now let us return once more to the idea of energy, but not in the modern sense of consumption and production, rather as the careful management of effort itself. Ancient technologies often sought to minimize unnecessary exertion, using leverage, balance, and natural forces to accomplish tasks efficiently without exhaustion. Simple machines like levers, pulleys, and inclined planes were applied with great sophistication, allowing small groups of people to move massive stones, lift heavy loads, and construct enduring structures. These methods were not secret or mysterious, but they required planning, cooperation, and a deep understanding of physical principles gained through experience rather than theory. As powered machinery replaced human-scale solutions, these skills were used less frequently and gradually forgotten, even though their underlying principles remain as valid as ever. Let us think now of time again, not as something measured, but as something experienced. Ancient technologies were often designed with long time horizons in mind, anticipating use across decades or even centuries. Materials were chosen for durability rather than appearance. Structures were built to be repaired rather than replaced. Knowledge was transmitted slowly, ensuring that it was absorbed deeply rather than quickly. This long view created technologies that aged gracefully, changing with time rather than breaking under it. When modern systems prioritize short-term efficiency and rapid turnover, this relationship with time shifts and technologies become increasingly fragile. Only later, when maintenance costs rise and systems fail prematurely, do we begin to question what was lost. As the narration continues to flow, you may notice that many of these forgotten technologies share a common quality. They require presence. They demand attention, care, and awareness. They cannot function properly when ignored or rushed. In this way, they mirror the state of mind we are entering now, one that values stillness, reflection, and gentle awareness over constant stimulation. Perhaps this is why they are so easy to forget in fast-moving societies, and why they feel so compelling to rediscover during moments of rest. Let us imagine, for a moment, a future historian looking back at our own time, sifting through the remains of systems we consider advanced and indispensable. Which of our technologies will seem obvious and intuitive, and which will appear fragile, wasteful, or strangely disconnected from their environment? Which practices will endure quietly, and which will vanish almost without trace, remembered only in fragments and speculation? This perspective reminds us that forgetting is not a failure unique to the past, but an ongoing process that accompanies change itself. As your breathing grows slower and more regular, allow these thoughts to settle without resistance. There is no need to judge the past or the present. Both are expressions of human adaptability, shaped by circumstances and constraints that are rarely fully visible from within. Forgotten technologies do not accuse us. They simply remind us that there are many ways to solve problems, many paths through the landscape of necessity and imagination. And so, as we remain here for a while longer, suspended in this calm reflection, let us hold one final, gentle idea. That remembering is not always about recovering exact techniques or recreating specific tools. Sometimes it is about rediscovering attitudes, patience, attentiveness, respect for limits, and a willingness to learn slowly from the world around us. These attitudes are technologies in their own right, subtle yet powerful, and they have never truly disappeared. They rest quietly, waiting for conditions that invite them back into use. As we remain in this quiet current of thought, it becomes increasingly clear that many of the technologies we now call forgotten were never designed to stand apart from daily life as special achievements, but instead existed so seamlessly within ordinary routines that the people who used them may never have thought of them as inventions at all, but simply as the natural way things were done. When knowledge is woven so deeply into habit, it becomes invisible, and what is invisible is rarely recorded, rarely celebrated, and rarely protected against loss. In this way, the most essential technologies often leave the faintest traces behind. Think again of fire, not as a dramatic force, but as a companion that shaped human life in subtle, continuous ways. Ancient hearths were carefully designed to regulate airflow, conserve fuel, and distribute warmth evenly through living spaces, allowing families to gather, cook, rest, and share stories without choking smoke or wasted heat. The placement of stones, the height of openings, and the shape of chimneys were refined slowly through observation rather than calculation, passed down through repetition rather than instruction. These hearths were not just sources of heat, but centers of social life, anchoring daily rhythms and seasonal routines. When centralized heating replaced them, something more than a structure was lost, and with it, a body of practical knowledge about fire management that had once been nearly universal. Now consider the quiet technology of scheduling life itself. In many ancient societies, time was organized around natural cues rather than fixed hours, with work intensifying or slowing according to daylight, temperature, and seasonal demand. This flexible relationship with time allowed people to conserve energy, reduce stress, and align effort with opportunity rather than obligation. Tasks were performed when conditions were right, not simply when a clock demanded it. As mechanical timekeeping spread, life became increasingly segmented, standardized, and detached from environmental signals. Efficiency increased, but adaptability decreased, and the older wisdom of pacing effort according to natural rhythms faded into the background. Only now do we begin to recognize how deeply this shift has affected well-being, productivity, and sustainability. Let us drift gently toward the idea of learning again, not as formal education, but as an ongoing process embedded within daily activity. In ancient communities, learning did not end at childhood, nor was it confined to designated spaces. Skills were refined across a lifetime, with elders continuing to learn alongside younger generations, adjusting techniques as conditions changed. Mistakes were not failures, but feedback, guiding gradual improvement rather than immediate correction. This kind of learning produced technologies that evolved slowly but steadily, shaped by real-world use rather than theoretical ideals. When modern systems emphasize rapid mastery and early specialization, this long arc of learning shortens, and with it, the depth of understanding that supports truly resilient technology. As the narration continues, let us consider the concept of boundaries, both physical and conceptual, and how ancient technologies often respected limits rather than attempting to overcome them entirely. Instead of forcing water uphill indefinitely, people settled where gravity could be harnessed. Instead of extracting resources endlessly from one place, they rotated sites, allowing recovery over time. Instead of building ever higher, they built broader, distributing weight and stress rather than concentrating it. These decisions were not signs of limitation, but expressions of balance, recognizing that working within constraints often produces more durable solutions than attempting to eliminate them altogether. When modern technologies promise limitless growth and unrestricted control, they sometimes obscure the costs of ignoring boundaries, costs that only become visible later. Now let us return to the quieter realm of social technology, the invisible systems that govern cooperation, trust, and shared responsibility. Many ancient societies developed intricate customs for resolving conflict, distributing resources, and maintaining social cohesion without centralized enforcement. Reputation, reciprocity, and shared memory played crucial roles in regulating behavior, reducing the need for formal control mechanisms. These systems functioned effectively only as long as communities remained small enough for relationships to matter and memory to persist. When populations grew and social distance increased, such technologies struggled to scale and were replaced by written laws, institutions, and enforcement structures. In the process, a nuanced understanding of human motivation and social balance was partially lost, replaced by more rigid but less adaptable systems. Let us pause for a moment here, allowing the mind to rest within the gentle repetition of these ideas, noticing how often forgetting occurs not through rejection, but through replacement, as older methods are quietly set aside in favor of new ones that promise speed, convenience, or control. Replacement rarely preserves the full understanding of what it displaces. And so much is lost not at the moment of change, but in the years that follow, when no one remembers how things were done before. As we continue onward, think now of the relationship between technology and identity. In many ancient cultures, skills were closely tied to a person's sense of self, their role within the community, and their connection to ancestry. To know how to build, heal, farm, or navigate was not merely practical knowledge, but a source of meaning and belonging. Technologies were expressions of who people were, not just what they used. When work becomes abstracted, fragmented, or automated, this connection weakens and technology becomes external, something owned rather than embodied. With that shift, knowledge becomes easier to forget because it is no longer integrated into identity. Now imagine again the slow passing of generations, each one inheriting not only tools and techniques, but assumptions about how the world works and what is worth paying attention to. Some knowledge is preserved because it aligns with those assumptions. Other knowledge, equally valuable, is overlooked because it does not fit prevailing priorities. This selective memory shapes history as much as any event, determining which technologies are remembered, celebrated, and taught, and which quietly slip away. What survives, then, is not necessarily what was best, but what was compatible with the direction society happened to be moving. As your breathing continues to slow, let these reflections soften further, allowing them to blend into one another without the need for clear boundaries or conclusions. The story of forgotten technologies is not a story with a single lesson or destination. It is a landscape wide and varied, filled with paths that cross, diverge, and sometimes disappear altogether. Wandering through it does not require certainty, only curiosity and patience. Let us think now of silence itself as a kind of technology, deliberately cultivated in many ancient practices as a space for listening, reflection, and subtle perception. Silence allowed people to notice changes in weather, shifts in animal behavior, and movements of the body that might otherwise go unnoticed. It supported memory, creativity, and emotional regulation. When constant noise and stimulation become the norm, this quiet technology is among the first to be lost, even though it requires no tools at all. Only in moments like this, when the pace slows and attention settles, does its value become apparent again. As we near the end of this segment of the journey, allow one more gentle realization to surface. That forgetting is not the opposite of knowing, but part of the same cycle. Knowledge emerges, serves its purpose, fades, and sometimes returns in new forms, shaped by different contexts and needs. What matters is not preserving everything unchanged, but remaining open to learning from what came before, even when its lessons arrive indirectly, through fragments, echoes, and rediscoveries. As this quiet journey continues, it becomes increasingly apparent that the most enduring ancient technologies were rarely designed to impress, dominate, or astonish, but instead to disappear into the background of everyday life, functioning so reliably and predictably that they became almost invisible to the people who depended on them. When something works quietly day after day without drama or failure, it ceases to draw attention, and attention, as history reminds us, is often the first step toward preservation. Invisibility, while peaceful, carries risk. Think now of pathways worn into the earth, not paved roads, but narrow trails shaped by countless footsteps over generations, following routes that avoid flooding, minimize effort, and provide shelter from wind and sun. These paths were not planned on maps. They were discovered through use. Each step confirmed or corrected the last, slowly refining the route until it represented the most efficient passage possible for that landscape. When modern infrastructure arrived, these trails were abandoned, erased, or built over, dismissed as informal and imprecise. Yet many modern roads now struggle against terrain those older paths had already learned to respect. The wisdom embedded in footsteps vanished quietly, without ever being written down. Let us drift toward the idea of balance once more, because balance appears again and again wherever forgotten technologies are found. Balance between effort and rest, balance between use and renewal, balance between innovation and tradition. Ancient systems often avoided extremes not because they lacked ambition, but because experience had taught them the cost of pushing too far in any one direction. Forests were harvested selectively. Fields were left fallow periodically. Fishing grounds were rotated. These were technologies of restraint, informed by observation rather than ideology. When restraint is no longer valued, such technologies fade, replaced by systems that maximize output while minimizing patience. Only later, when resources diminish, does restraint reappear, often under a different name. Now consider the ancient relationship with materials themselves, not as inert substances, but as collaborators with distinct behaviors and limitations. Stone expands and contracts. Wood breathes, clay remembers the pressure of hands. Ancient builders and craftsmen learned these qualities through prolonged contact, adjusting their techniques to accommodate rather than resist them. Structures were designed to move slightly, tools to wear gradually, objects to age visibly. Modern materials promise uniformity and predictability, yet they often lack this quiet adaptability, leading to sudden failure rather than gradual change. With the loss of material intimacy comes a loss of anticipation, the ability to sense when something is nearing its limits. As your breathing remains slow and steady, let us reflect gently on the idea of redundancy, a principle that ancient technologies embraced far more openly than many modern systems do. Rather than relying on a single solution, ancient communities often maintained multiple overlapping methods to accomplish essential tasks. If one failed, another could compensate. Multiple water sources, multiple crops, multiple skills shared among many people. This redundancy reduced efficiency but increased resilience. When modern systems streamline operations to eliminate redundancy, they gain speed but lose flexibility. The forgotten wisdom here is not inefficiency but insurance built quietly into daily life. Let us turn again toward knowledge transmission, not in the abstract, but in the lived reality of teaching and learning through shared activity. In many ancient societies, instruction occurred through participation rather than explanation. Children learned by watching, copying, and gradually contributing, absorbing not only techniques but judgment, timing, and context. This form of learning created deep understanding, but it required time, patience, and continuity. When education became separated from practice, accelerated, and standardized, knowledge became easier to distribute but harder to embody. Skills that depended on subtle cues and experiential feedback suffered most. They could not survive the transition intact. Now imagine the slow accumulation of mistakes, adjustments, and refinements that shaped ancient technologies across centuries. Each generation inherited imperfect solutions and improved them slightly, not through radical redesign, but through incremental change. This process required humility, a willingness to accept that no solution was final. Modern innovation often seeks dramatic breakthroughs, overlooking the power of gradual refinement. As a result, technologies may advance quickly, but also age poorly, lacking the deep testing that only time can provide. The ancient approach reminds us that progress does not always need to be visible to be meaningful. Let us drift now into the concept of trust, an invisible but essential technology that underpinned many ancient systems. Trust between neighbors allowed shared resources to function. Trust in tradition allowed practices to persist long enough to prove their value. Trust in elders preserved memory across generations. When trust eroded, systems collapsed regardless of their technical sophistication. Modern technologies often attempt to replace trust with control, automation, and enforcement. While effective in some contexts, this substitution can weaken social bonds, making systems more brittle over time. The ancient lesson here is subtle but powerful. Technology functions best when supported by relationships. As the narration continues, notice how frequently forgotten technologies depend on slowness. Slowness in observation, slowness in learning, slowness in response. This slowness is not inefficiency but attentiveness. It allows patterns to emerge that remain invisible at higher speeds. When everything accelerates, these patterns disappear, and with them, the insights that once guided decision-making. Only when pace slows again do those insights reappear, familiar yet strangely new. Let us now imagine a moment far in the future when our own technologies have aged, degraded, or disappeared, leaving behind fragments for others to interpret. What assumptions will they make? What knowledge will seem obvious to them, and what will remain mysterious? Which of our systems will endure quietly, and which will fail dramatically, leaving little behind? This thought does not judge. It simply places us within the same cycle we have been observing, reminding us that forgetting is not a flaw of the past, but a feature of time itself. As we approach the end of this segment, allow one final, gentle idea to settle, that forgotten technologies are not relics demanding recovery, but teachers offering perspective. They remind us that intelligence has many forms, that progress is contextual, and that solutions arise not only from innovation, but from attention, patience, and humility. They whisper rather than shout, and they wait. As the thread of reflection stretches onward, it becomes increasingly evident that forgotten technologies often linger not as complete systems, but as fragments scattered across memory, landscape, and tradition, waiting patiently for someone to notice them not as curiosities, but as quiet expressions of human attentiveness to the world. These fragments are rarely dramatic. They are subtle, understated, and easily overlooked, especially in times when attention is drawn toward novelty rather than continuity. Yet it is precisely their subtlety that allowed them to endure for so long. Consider again the relationship between ancient people and the land they inhabited, a relationship shaped not by ownership in the modern sense, but by familiarity, intimacy, and long observation across generations. Land was not something to be conquered or reshaped endlessly, but something to be listened to, negotiated with, and adapted to slowly. Technologies emerged from this dialogue. Houses were placed where the ground remained dry after heavy rain. Fields followed the contours of hills rather than flattening them. Settlements shifted gradually over time, responding to changes in water flow, soil fertility, and climate patterns. This adaptability was itself a form of technology, one that required humility and patience rather than force. When later societies sought permanence and control above all else, this flexible relationship weakened, and with it, the technologies that depended upon it. Let us think now about the ancient understanding of cycles, a perspective that shaped nearly every aspect of life, from agriculture and architecture to governance and ritual. Cycles of seasons, cycles of life and death. Cycles of growth, rest, and renewal. Technologies were designed not to interrupt these cycles, but to move within them, supporting natural rhythms rather than replacing them. Fields rested after harvest, tools were repaired during winter, construction followed seasonal availability of materials and labor. This cyclical approach allowed systems to recover naturally, reducing strain and preventing exhaustion. When linear models of progress replaced cyclical thinking, systems became more productive in the short term, but also more vulnerable to collapse when pushed beyond their limits. As the mind continues to soften, let us turn toward the idea of observation as a technological skill in its own right. Ancient observers spent long hours watching subtle changes that unfolded slowly over time, developing an ability to notice patterns invisible to hurried eyes. They observed how animals behaved before storms, how plants responded to shifting light, how water moved differently after heavy rains. These observations were not isolated data points, but part of a continuous awareness that informed decision-making across many domains. This kind of observational intelligence required presence, patience, and a willingness to remain with uncertainty. When modern tools provide instant measurements and predictions, this slower form of knowing often fades, even though it remains essential for understanding complex, dynamic systems. Now consider the quiet technology of memory itself, a capacity that ancient societies cultivated deliberately through repetition, storytelling, and ritual. Stories were not merely entertainment. They were repositories of practical knowledge, moral guidance, and historical record, structured in ways that made them memorable and adaptable. A story could be retold slightly differently to fit new circumstances, allowing knowledge to evolve without being lost. When written records replaced oral tradition, memory became externalized, and with it, the skill of holding complex information internally weakened. This shift brought great benefits, but it also introduced vulnerability, as written knowledge depends on preservation, access, and interpretation. When those conditions fail, memory fades quickly. Let us now explore the idea of slowness once more, not as an absence of progress, but as a deliberate choice that shaped many ancient technologies. Slowness allowed for feedback, for correction, for reflection. A structure built slowly could be adjusted as flaws appeared. A farming practice refined over decades could respond to subtle changes in climate. A social system that evolved gradually could adapt to shifting relationships. Modern systems often favor speed, assuming that errors can be corrected later. Yet rapid change can outpace understanding, creating problems that are difficult to reverse. Ancient slowness was not hesitation, but caution informed by experience. As the narration continues, let us reflect gently on the role of humility in forgotten technologies. Many ancient solutions were not designed to solve every problem universally, but to address specific needs within specific contexts. They did not assume dominance over nature, but coexistence. They acknowledged limits openly. This humility allowed technologies to remain flexible, adaptable, and sustainable over long periods. When technologies promise total control or universal application, they often ignore local complexity, leading to unintended consequences. The ancient approach reminds us that not every problem requires a permanent or global solution. Sometimes a temporary, localized response is enough. Now imagine a craftsman at the end of a long day, setting down tools that have been used carefully and deliberately, not worn out by haste, but shaped gradually by repeated use. Each tool carries memory. Each mark tells a story. This intimacy between maker, tool, and task creates knowledge that cannot be easily transferred or replicated. It must be lived. When production becomes distant and anonymous, this intimacy dissolves, and with it, a form of understanding that once guided design and use. objects become interchangeable. And when objects are interchangeable, the knowledge embedded within them becomes easier to forget. Let us turn now to the idea of error and how ancient technologies often treated mistakes not as failures to be eliminated, but as information to be integrated. Mistakes revealed limits. They showed where assumptions were wrong. They guided adjustments. This approach required tolerance for imperfection and a willingness to learn slowly. Modern systems often seek to eliminate error entirely through automation and control, yet this can reduce opportunities for learning, making failures rarer but more catastrophic when they occur. Ancient technologies accepted small errors as part of ongoing adaptation, creating resilience through continuous adjustment rather than rigid optimization. As your breathing remains calm and steady, let us reflect on how ancient people understood ownership and responsibility in relation to technology. Tools and systems were often shared, maintained collectively, and valued for their contribution to community rather than individual status. This collective relationship encouraged care, accountability, and continuity. When technologies become privately owned and detached from communal responsibility, maintenance and stewardship can suffer, especially when short-term gain outweighs long-term care. The ancient model reminds us that how technology is owned and shared influences how well it is preserved and understood. Now imagine again the long passage of time, generations flowing one into the next, each inheriting not only physical artifacts but assumptions about what matters, what is possible, and what is worth remembering. Some technologies align naturally with these assumptions and survive. Others do not, and so they fade quietly, leaving behind traces that later generations may struggle to interpret. This selective inheritance shapes history more than we often realize. What we call forgotten was not necessarily unimportant. It was simply out of alignment with the direction society chose to move. As the narration continues to stretch onward, let us hold a gentle awareness that rediscovery does not always require reconstruction. Sometimes it requires reframing. Ancient technologies need not be replicated exactly to be valuable. Their underlying principles can inform new solutions adapted to modern contexts: balance, patience, local adaptation, redundancy, respect for limits. These are not outdated ideas. They are timeless responses to complexity. Now allow the pace to slow even further, as though the story itself were settling into rest. There is no need to carry every idea forward consciously. They can drift, they can overlap. They can fade at the edges. This is how memory works best, not through force, but through gentle repetition and association. As we approach the close of this segment, let one final reflection arise softly: that humanity has never lacked intelligence or creativity. What changes is how that intelligence is expressed, valued, and remembered. Forgotten technologies are reminders not of failure, but of choice. They show us the paths not taken, the solutions set aside, and the knowledge that waits quietly for conditions that invite its return. As this long reflection carries on, it becomes increasingly gentle to recognize that many forgotten technologies were never intended to be preserved as knowledge in the abstract, but were instead designed to live only as long as the conditions that required them, fading naturally when those conditions changed, much like seasonal behaviors in nature that appear when needed and retreat when the environment shifts. In this sense, forgetting is not always a loss, but sometimes a sign that life has moved on to a different arrangement, leaving behind tools that no longer fit the moment. Yet even when a technology fades, the way of thinking that created it often remains dormant. waiting quietly for circumstances that invite its return. Consider how ancient people understood weather, not as a collection of isolated events, but as a flowing conversation between land, sky, water, and living things. They watched cloud shapes and wind direction with care. They noticed the behavior of animals, the smell of the air, the subtle changes in sound that preceded storms. These observations formed a practical technology of prediction, one that did not rely on instruments but on attentiveness developed through years of lived experience. This knowledge was deeply local, accurate within its environment, and difficult to transfer elsewhere. When modern forecasting tools arrived, this intimate weather literacy declined, not because it was ineffective, but because it was no longer necessary for survival. Only now, as extreme weather challenges prediction models, does interest in traditional observational knowledge quietly reemerge. Let us drift now toward the quiet world of materials again, especially those drawn directly from the earth with minimal transformation. Stone, clay, wood, fiber. Ancient technologies often favored materials that could return to the environment without lasting harm, materials that aged visibly and predictably, allowing people to anticipate change rather than be surprised by it. A wooden beam would creak before failing, clay would crack slowly, stone would shift subtly over time. These gradual signals were part of the technology itself, offering feedback long before catastrophe. Modern materials often fail suddenly, without warning, severing the feedback loop that once guided maintenance and care. With that loss comes a different relationship to risk, one that depends more heavily on monitoring systems and less on human perception. As the narration continues, let us think gently about how ancient societies balanced innovation with continuity. New ideas were introduced cautiously, tested alongside existing practices rather than replacing them entirely. This created layered systems, where older methods remained available as backups while newer ones proved themselves over time. Such layering slowed change but increased resilience. When modern innovation cycles accelerate, older systems are often dismantled quickly, leaving little margin for error if new solutions fail. The ancient approach reminds us that redundancy and patience can be powerful forms of intelligence, even if they appear inefficient by modern standards. Now consider again the role of storytelling, not merely as entertainment, but as a sophisticated technology for transmitting complex information in memorable, adaptable forms. Stories encoded navigation routes, ecological knowledge, ethical guidelines, and historical memory, all within narratives that could be recalled easily and reshaped subtly for new contexts. This flexibility allowed knowledge to survive change, but also meant it could drift if not carefully maintained. When stories were dismissed as myths rather than recognized as knowledge systems, much of their practical content was lost. Only fragments remain, often misunderstood because the context that gave them meaning has vanished. Let us slow once more and reflect on the quiet importance of limits in shaping ancient technologies. Limits of energy, limits of materials, limits of labor. Rather than attempting to eliminate these constraints, ancient solutions often worked creatively within them, producing systems that were stable, sustainable, and well-matched to their environments. These limits encouraged ingenuity rather than stifling it. When modern technologies promise to transcend limits entirely, they can encourage overreach, leading to systems that strain resources and collapse under their own complexity. The ancient lesson here is not restriction, but alignment, recognizing that working with constraints can produce harmony rather than frustration. As your awareness remains soft, let us revisit the idea of repair, not only of objects, but of systems and relationships. Ancient technologies were often maintained through continuous, small acts of care rather than large-scale interventions. Canals were cleared regularly, walls were reinforced incrementally, tools were sharpened frequently. This approach prevented minor issues from becoming major failures. When maintenance becomes centralized, deferred, or invisible, systems may appear stable while quietly accumulating stress. The ancient emphasis on constant, attentive care fostered a different relationship with technology, one based on stewardship rather than consumption. Now imagine again the rhythm of daily life in a world where technology does not demand constant attention, but supports activity quietly in the background. Water flows where needed, shelter moderates temperature naturally, tools perform their functions without complexity. In such a world, mental energy is freed for observation, creativity, and social connection. When technology becomes intrusive, demanding constant management, updates, and monitoring, it can fragment attention and obscure the very problems it was meant to solve. Forgotten technologies often excelled precisely because they required so little oversight. Let us turn now to the idea of scale one last time, considering how ancient technologies often operated effectively at human scale, matching the size, strength, and cognitive limits of their users. Tasks were designed to be accomplished by individuals or small groups without specialized infrastructure. This made systems flexible and adaptable, capable of responding quickly to change. As technologies scale beyond human comprehension, they require abstraction, delegation, and control structures that distance people from direct understanding. With that distance comes vulnerability, as fewer individuals can grasp how systems truly function. The ancient preference for human-scale solutions kept knowledge distributed and accessible, even if it limited growth. As the narration continues its gentle flow, allow the idea of continuity to settle in again. Ancient technologies were rarely revolutionary. They evolved gradually, shaped by countless small decisions rather than singular moments of inspiration. This slow evolution produced systems deeply tuned to their contexts, but also difficult to recognize as innovations. History often celebrates dramatic change, overlooking the quiet power of gradual refinement. Forgotten technologies remind us that progress does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives silently, and sometimes it leaves just as quietly. Let us think again of the human body, not only as a user of technology, but as a source of technological insight. Ancient practices often mirrored bodily rhythms, aligning work with daylight, rest with darkness, effort with recovery. Tools were designed to amplify human strength without exceeding natural limits, reducing injury and fatigue. When technologies push bodies beyond their adaptive capacity, health suffers. Only later do we rediscover the value of alignment with natural rhythms, often through practices that echo ancient wisdom. As we near the end of this long continuation, allow one final idea to arise gently, that forgotten technologies are not warnings or prescriptions, but invitations. They invite us to reconsider our relationship with time, attention, and the world around us. They remind us that intelligence can be quiet, that solutions can be modest, and that sustainability often emerges from patience rather than control. And so, as we arrive at the quiet end of this long reflection, there is no final revelation waiting, no single conclusion that gathers everything neatly together, because the story of forgotten technologies was never meant to resolve itself in that way. It was always meant to feel like this instead: open, lingering, unfinished in the most peaceful sense. What we have explored together is not a list of inventions, nor a catalogue of lost skills, but a way of seeing the past that moves slowly, listens carefully, and respects the idea that knowledge does not always announce itself loudly when it arrives, nor does it always make noise when it leaves. Much of what humanity once knew did not vanish in flames or disaster. It simply rested, it stepped aside, it waited for another time. And perhaps that time is not behind us at all, but quietly ahead. If you have listened this far, then you have already done something rare. You have slowed down. You have allowed your mind to move at a different pace, one that history itself often prefers, where understanding forms gradually without pressure, and where curiosity is gentle rather than demanding. That alone is worth acknowledging. Before we part, I want to invite you to stay connected. If this story brought you calm, curiosity, or even a sense of quiet wonder, then I invite you to subscribe to the channel so you can continue joining me for more slow journeys through history, forgotten knowledge, and peaceful reflection. These stories are always here for rest, for sleep, or simply for moments when the world feels too fast. And I would love to hear from you. Where are you listening from tonight? Whether you are drifting off in a quiet room, resting after a long day, or simply letting the story play in the background, take a moment if you feel like it, and leave a comment saying where in the world you are listening from. It's always meaningful to see how far these quiet stories travel. And finally, to my friends who watched this all the way through, who stayed until the very end, who listened patiently and supported this journey in silence and in spirit, I invite you as well to leave a comment. Your presence matters more than you know. For now, there is nothing left to do, nothing left to follow, nothing left to remember, only rest. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and until next time, sleep well.